Mark, thank you so much for chatting to me today. I'm really excited to learn more about your leadership, both with your incredible transformation of Georgia State and your current position as APLU president. So congratulations again on that.
Thank you, Tracy. It's great to be here and really excited to have this conversation with you.
But first, as our alum of our statistics program, what's it like to be back on campus?
Well, this is Happy Valley, so of course it's great. And I think, I drove in from Northern Virginia this morning, and it's a beautiful fall day when we're doing this shoot. So it was just a gorgeous drive up, and just so many memories coming back. And the one thing you sort of come to appreciate as you go through your career is you don't remember time, you remember moments.
Yeah.
And so as you reflect back, and of course moments in Beaver Stadium. Everybody that's been in Happy Valley, Penn State grad, has those. But the one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is it was here that literally I saw my life change in a huge way. As a first generation college student, came to grad school thinking maybe I could be a professor, but I didn't actually know anybody with a PhD other than professors. And remember sitting in Pond Lab in class with Professor Tom Heppensberger at the time, teaching theory of nonparametrics. Yep. Not everybody's favorite course, but it was interesting to me. And sitting there, and there was just this one day, I remember where I was in the room, I remember how the sun was, and this sort of light bulb goes off and go, I can do this. And it was sitting there, and I knew what he was going to say next. I knew where the lecture was going. I knew where the course was going. It's like, he can do this, I can do this. And so it's those kinds of memories. It just gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling to be back where that happened.
Oh, that's awesome. Pivotal moments.
Yep,
and I think that's a great example of the importance of role models as well.
I was very blessed to have a great set of faculty here, a great set of professors. My advisor, the late Cliff Clogg, was just extraordinary.
All right, so I have a well-thumbed copy of the book, well, at least the stream, okay. Which really talks about your leadership of an upstart urban university and how you rewrote the rules of a broken system. So I found it incredibly inspiring. One of the things that struck me was multiple times there was mention of keeping students in the net. Can you just say a little more about?
Yeah, so just a little context. Georgia State, at that point, when I started, was 28,000 undergraduates. Today, including absorbing a community college, over nearly 50,000. So it's a big operation. But very importantly, majority minority, 60% Pell, which means 60% of the students from low income, lots of first generation students. And our graduation rates when we started this work, which the beginning of the work predates my arrival in 2009, but we basically pick it up and we look at why are students leaving the university. And students were 7 or 8 times more likely to drop out for financial reasons than academic. It wasn't that students were dropping out of colleges, they were leaving because of the stuff in life that just happens. So if you're a low-income student and your car breaks down and you're a commuter student, you can't get to class. Or if you have dependents on a family member for helping with your tuition or your bills and they lose their job, you're out. Or the opposite happens, they lose their job and they now need you to work to help support the family. So there were so many of these life happens, things happens moments that basically take promising students off track and out of the university. So that's part one. Part two is the data were really strong to us that if you leave, your likelihood of coming back is actually quite small. So they're very often people say, well, I'll stop out for a semester.
Right. Get everything under control,
exactly.
And then I'll come back in.
And tragically, it doesn't happen very often. It happens some, but not nearly as often as you would hope. So when we started our work, we had, I think, one what I'll call mindset epiphany. It wasn't mine, it was Tim Rennick who led this work, which was we needed to design the student experience. And so thinking about, we think about designing curriculum so students progress academically, but we needed to design how the student experienced the university from the day they made an inquiry to the institution, up through the admissions process, matriculation, orientation, all the way through.
Selecting their courses.
All the way to getting their job and leaving with that diploma.
Right.
And so that was part of it is we got to look at that journey and see where are the places that people are hitting roadblocks, where are they getting tripped up. And so that was the part about keeping them in the net. And then part of our mindset was a metaphor that I've always used in talking about this, is if you're driving your car down the road and you just move the steering wheel a little bit, you're going to start to drift off the road. If you don't make that adjustment, you're going to crash and you may never get back on the road. So our mindset was if we design this in such a way that we could detect when students needed those small adjustments.
Right, and make little tweaks that would,
that we can greatly improve the outcomes for those students. And then lastly, because we were a large institution and we didn't have a lot of money, it's at Penn State and every institution, but certainly every public, you never have the money you need to do all the things you want to do, is we knew we couldn't do little things here and there and everywhere.
Right.
We had to operate at scale. So we were looking at designing this, but looking at making design changes across the institution so that every student can benefit. And so that was how we approached it, and managed to do a few things there.
Yeah, there was a moment in the book where there was an example of a student who had somebody on their side that helped them navigate. And you were quoted as kind of talking about how we need to scale this up so that we don't rely on students finding the person and have a more systematic approach.
Yeah, the way I would talk about it is historically, if a student found their own angel.
Yes, right.
If you're at a university or a college, and this happens in community colleges all the time, and that angel could be, it could be a janitor, it could be a police officer, it could be a secretary, it could be the university president, but somebody who takes an interest in you.
Yeah.
And the question was, how do we design it so that everybody has that opportunity instead of just those who are fortunate?
Yeah.
Fortunate that somebody believed in them, somebody that they found. And
Right.
so that led to a lot of our, how we literally changed the whole model around how do you do student advising.
Yes.
Which, we took an approach that at the time was controversial, wasn't uniformly popular among some of my academic brethren and sisters. And a lot of institutions have said, well, I don't know if I could do that at my place, but we were able to do it because we were very focused on those students.
Right. Thank you. You had so many initiatives that we certainly can't talk about all of them, but one of the things that they all have in common is this really macro level, systematic, data-driven approach.
Yep.
So this was not that common at the time.
Well, and what's going to make it even more interesting is, everybody's assumed, because my background is statistics, that I brought this to Georgia State.
Yeah.
The reality is, Tim Rennick, who's the architect of most of these programs, Tim and his team, and by the time we get to the end of the book, Tim has over 1,000 people in his team. He starts off as an associate provost, literally with himself and a few people, and we build this over time. My favorite part of this, and Tim's PhD is in religion. So 6 months before I become president, gets brought into the provost office to see what we can do to improve graduation and retention rates. And so he's looking at the literature, et cetera. And what he comes to realize is there's real religion in the data. That if you look at the data, you can start to get ideas of where things go awry. So the way that I think as important as our focus on data is our adoption of the scientific method, which I don't think you will object to.
No.
We spend a lot of time teaching the scientific method. We teach it to thousands of students in biology, chemistry, and physics, at a minimum every semester, every year, but we don't actually do it.
Yeah.
And so what we had data. We had lots of data, and we eventually built a data warehouse.
That's cool.
Where we basically all our data are in one place, so we can look at any question that the data would allow us to investigate. But then the second part was to take what we see in the data, formulate a hypothesis. I feel strange lecturing you on the scientific method, but formulate a hypothesis, and then think of an intervention that not only could solve the problem we're looking at, but also could scale. Okay, staying within, back to that earlier question, that is going to be something we, so it can't be an intervention that will work for math majors but not biology majors, for example. It has to be something that we could scale because we didn't have the resources to break the university into small parts. And then, you run the study to the extent, and, there are different types. We did randomized controlled trials in some cases. Other cases, we had to use more observational comparisons depending on what the intervention was. But that was the whole discipline we developed. And one of the things I found when I read the book is you actually, the book is about the work we did, but I learned a lot about what we did from people that got interviewed. So when I mentioned the data warehouse, I didn't know we didn't have a data warehouse when I started. But sitting in a meeting with my senior leadership team, I said, well, we're going to need to be able to do this, we're going to need to be able to do that. And he's quoted in the book, the head of institutional research goes back and says, we're going to need to build a data warehouse because the president's going to have a lot of questions. And so there's just all sorts of decisions being made that don't seem to be well formed. That was, an example was Keep Hope Alive was in Georgia. There's a Hope Scholarship, which is based on your high school record. You get money on top of any Pell Grants, loans, scholarships, et cetera, to help you go to college. So basically, very poor students can afford to go by putting together these different resources. But if you let your GPA drop below 3, you lose the scholarship. And so that's one of those moments, again, where you then get kicked off. And so it's that systemic approach. So Keep Hope Alive was an experiment where we had a control group. And the intervention was, clearly this was an academic issue in this case because their GPAs were low, to basically, it was a program to give students academic study skills, how to prepare for exams, how to take notes, how to ask questions of professors, et cetera. And then another part I know you're a big fan of is peer advising. And so realizing that for first generation and low income students, again, we knew from data that those students tend not to go to office hours. They tend not to show up at the professor's door and say, I need help. So we started identifying students just like them who had excelled in these courses, and we had to, of course, focus on courses that had high failure or dropout rates, and got what I call the win-win situation is as a faculty member, that you learn more by teaching than you do by being the student. So you take a student who is, again, a similarly situated student who's already shown promise, and you're just now helping them get better at what they do, perhaps helping them get ready for graduate school at the same time that they're helping their peers, and they're much more accessible. So, we ran a little experiment. Students had, I think it was close to a letter grade higher in the experimental group, go to scale. So we developed a healthy respect for being able to look at the data and do experiments. It's a lot of fun.
So pivoting to your current role
Yep.
as APLU president, what do you see as some of the trends and opportunities in higher ed in the coming decade?
A larger conversation in the country about what is the value of higher ed.
Okay.
When I was growing up, there was no question. My parents were Depression era. They did not have the benefits of a college education. It was assumed that going to college was going to lead to a better life than they had, and they were right. That's no longer taken as an assumption, particularly given, as states have disinvested in higher ed, the tuition has gone up, even at our public institutions, which are still a great value, but it's become much more expensive. Students take out a lot of loans, and they may not get a job that allows them to actually service that debt and cover living, rent, mortgage, family, children, cars, gas, inflationary pressures, So the debt crisis is a symptom of something much larger, which is we've got to get our heads around, as a country and in our institutions about how can we do better with this, and particularly the value proposition needs to be clearer. There's thinking back to what I'll call the approach we took, the Georgia State approach, is systematically is people say, well, they took out loans, didn't they know what they were doing? And if you look at the data for this country, tragically, most Americans haven't saved appropriately for retirement. So why would we expect that they're going to be better at taking out loans related to their college educations? And so there you can think about a student that takes out $100,000 or $200,000 in debt, which is not the norm, but it happens. then going into a career that pays starting salary $40,000 a year.
Yeah.
You're never going to be able to service that.
Yeah.
So that, and as I told a lot of presidents that are members of APLU, we may live in a country right now where the politics are, as they say, polarized. Mm-hmm. There is a bipartisan consensus in Washington that higher ed is too expensive, and it's not producing the workforce America needs. And so we as leaders of public higher education have a responsibility to step up and come up with solutions, whether it's more transparency in how we work with students, prospective students and their families, about what are the real costs going to be, what's the difference between a grant and a loan, how much debt can you expect to graduate with, what kind of job can you expect? There's some recent reports that students in college today are expecting salaries roughly twice what the starting salaries are in the workforce. And so there's a lot that we can do, that we can design into the system. Then the other part is then the workforce America needs is students, employers. We keep hearing they're not job ready, they're not ready for work. I'm not sure that's not 100% true, but you hear enough of these stories that it does give you pause to say, okay, how can we do a better job? So again, when I look at this systematically, and actually at the Georgia State, the work that we did, we were not only looking at academic success, but even back in 2010 when we started laying out our plans, we were looking at that career trajectory. Yeah. So the sort of conversations with students in the freshman year about you need to get to the Career Center, because one of the most valuable things you can do in addition to going to class and getting good grades and graduating is have an internship, or depending on what your trajectory is, undergraduate research experience. There's all sorts of experiential opportunities. There's leadership opportunities, whether that's in fraternities and sororities, various other clubs and organizations. And we wanted to have those conversations with students when they were starting college, so that they understood that this is all part of the experience. It's not just what's in the books. It's not just what's in the class. But at the end of the day, you're going to graduate here and you're going to go for an interview. Whether it's for law school, med school, grad school, a
industry,
job. It could be working for government, could be industry, civil society, anything. They're going to ask you questions. It would help to have some idea what the questions are going to be. And have some idea how to answer them. We need to be more intentional about sharing with students that these things that you are demonstrating are going to have value to you when you leave here. So design that into the curriculum. It's not extra work, it's just recognition that in this process you have developed skills, and this is how you can talk about them, whether it's in your resume, whether it's in your interview. So I think this entire issue of how do we do a better job of helping students get ready for careers. We need to be in higher ed more accountable to our students in terms of what it costs, what they can expect, and accountable to the people that are going to employ them or continue to educate them after our institution.
So I think that nicely captures, you were quoted in the book talking about having twin ambitions of being a top tier research institute, plus allowing students access and affordability.
Income, financial well-being segregates by zip code, talent doesn't. And this is one of the things where I was able to get a lot of support within my state, within my city, from industry leaders, was this country needs all the talent that we have. It is globally competitive in the economic workplace. The financial standards that people want to live at, the standard of living they want to have, requires continued prosperity. We need all that talent. And so we need great research universities. We need a faculty that is more representative of our student body, so we need more diversity in our faculty. And there's that talent out there, and so it is combining that research and excellence with, back to your first question, is making sure that students aren't getting tripped up by the things that get in the way if you don't have the financial resources or the family support and background and experience. And so, the combination is, I think it's what this country needs, and it's fun to be part of being able to create some of that.
All right, so lastly, some advice. You have provided steady leadership through change, including significant budget cuts during the 2008 recession. Do you have any advice on leading effectively through change?
Yeah, I got a lot because I don't know how to tell you, but I cut more budgets than I increased over my career. My first year as a dean was a recession. My last year as a provost, we were going over the cliff into the financial crisis. I left to go to Georgia as a president, only to find out that Georgia was 6 months behind, so I went over the cliff again, and had to take tens of millions of dollars out of the budget for a second time, different institutions. The first thing I'll say is keep it in perspective. The one advantage of having gray hair is I've seen a lot. 2008, 2009, the financial recession, unemployment was high. Still wasn't as high as when I graduated college and came to Penn State in 1980. So I think just keeping it in perspective is, no matter how dark it gets, the sun is going to come up. So that's point one. Point two is, as a dean, you're responsible not only for today, you're responsible for the future. You have one huge responsibility is just the hiring and promoting of faculty, because they're going to be here for 30 some years. They're going to be here when you're no longer dean, so you have that. But in those recessionary moments where, literally I think of it metaphorically as, we're on a sailing ship. It is the darkest of dark, it's in the middle of the night. There's a storm raging. We're being thrown all about. What is my responsibility as a leader? What is your responsibility? Well, I know the storm will pass at some point. Things will get better. And so my responsibility is to make sure that when the storm does clear, that we're headed in the right direction with wind in our sails. So I have always used financial challenges as an opportunity to invest for the future. Keeping in perspective, the sun will come up, the storm will clear, but you want to be headed in the right direction. So it's the hardest times are the times when you have to stay most focused on the future. And then lastly is just very personally is self-care. These jobs are hard, the hours are long, the stresses are many, and when things are particularly difficult, there's lots of people that have ideas and are going to share them with you, and they may not always be kind in how they do it. So you got to take care of yourself. Make sure you sleep well, eat well, get exercise, take care of yourself, because there's long days, long hours, but you will do well. I'm sure of that.
That's a great message.
And I think on your worst days, think about just the great people and the great work, and the way that at our institutions, at a place like Eberly, that we've got faculty and staff who are committed to their students and trying to give them that amazing experience of discovery and of understanding. And the one thing that I would say for anybody who's ever is a professor, who's ever thought about is the most powerful thing a professor can ever do is, it can be metaphorically or physically, is touch a student on the shoulder and say, I think you would make a good doctor if you thought about medical school.
You can be.
And this is what happened to me. Was I had not one, not two, but three math professors. I don't know if they got together and coordinated this, but they all said, have you thought about becoming a professor? And that's what led me to Penn State and the rest of this journey.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for such an inspiring and informative conversation, and I look forward to continuing to see what you do with APLU.
We're going to try to do some positive things, try to work on those issues of making sure that we have affordable colleges that produce amazing graduates, and serve our public service as public research universities, and do everything we can to advocate for and support the research enterprise, which is so important to what you do and so important to our country that all of our APLU members do. So it's great to be back at Penn State. It's great to be in Eberly.
Thanks so much, Mark.
It's my pleasure.